Everyone at the funeral believed they were watching a grieving younger brother say goodbye to the man he loved most. They never questioned the tears, the trembling voice, or the heartbreaking speech about family. But hidden inside a black SUV across the street sat the very man they were burying. He watched his own funeral unfold while the brother who had betrayed him smiled for the cameras, unaware that the greatest mistake of his life wasn't trying to murder Ethan Carter. It was failing to finish the job. Before we begin, welcome to the channel. If you love stories filled with shocking betrayal, carefully planned revenge, unexpected twists, and unforgettable endings, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share. Your support helps us bring you more gripping stories every week. Now, let's begin. Chicago was a city where fortunes were built on ambition and destroyed by greed. Towering skyscrapers stretched into the clouds. Luxury penthouses overlooked Lake Michigan, and billion-dollar deals were signed every day behind polished boardroom doors. Among the most respected names in the city's business world was Carter Construction Group, a company that had transformed from a small family business into one of the largest commercial construction firms in the Midwest. To outsiders, the Carter family represented the American dream. Newspapers praised their success, business magazines celebrated their leadership, and charity organizations admired their generosity. But behind the polished image, expensive suits, and carefully rehearsed smiles, resentment had been quietly growing for decades. It wasn't the kind of resentment that exploded overnight. It was the slow, poisonous kind that settled into a person's heart year after year until it became impossible to separate ambition from hatred. Ethan Carter had spent his entire life earning everything he possessed. From the time he was a teenager, he followed his father to construction sites before sunrise, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. While other executives preferred air-conditioned offices, Ethan could often be found wearing a hard hat, walking unfinished buildings alongside engineers and laborers, listening to their concerns and solving problems himself. Employees respected him because he treated everyone equally. Whether someone was a senior executive or the newest apprentice on the payroll, Ethan knew their names, remembered their families, and never considered himself above anyone else. That humility earned him something money never could: loyalty. When Richard Carter announced his retirement, the board unanimously voted Ethan as the company's next chief executive officer. Nobody was surprised. He had dedicated 20 years to preparing for the role, and even Richard admitted that his oldest son had become a better businessman than he had ever been. Ryan Carter accepted the announcement with a smile so convincing that reporters described the brothers as inseparable partners leading the company's future together. Cameras captured Ryan hugging Ethan while employees applauded around them. Business journalists praised the family's unity, calling them the next generation of American entrepreneurship. Nobody noticed Ryan's eyes. They smiled far less than his mouth did. Hidden beneath that carefully rehearsed expression was a lifetime of jealousy that had begun long before either brother entered the construction business. Ever since childhood, Ryan had lived in Ethan's shadow. Teachers praised Ethan's discipline. Coaches admired Ethan's leadership. Their father trusted Ethan with responsibility, while Ryan was repeatedly told to become more focused, more mature, and more dependable. Every compliment Ethan received felt like another reminder that Ryan would always be second. As the years passed, admiration turned into envy. Envy became resentment, and resentment slowly transformed into something far darker. Ryan stopped wanting to become successful. Instead, he began wanting Ethan to fail. Unlike Ethan, Ryan possessed a different kind of intelligence. He understood people. He could walk into a room filled with strangers and leave with future business partners, political connections, and investors eager to shake his hand. His charisma was effortless, his confidence contagious, and his ability to manipulate emotions almost impossible to detect. He knew exactly what people wanted to hear, and he rarely revealed what he was actually thinking. While Ethan built trust through honesty, Ryan built influence through appearances. The two brothers complemented each other so perfectly that everyone believed Carter Construction was unstoppable. Unfortunately, Ryan had already begun imagining what the company would look like, with only one brother left alive. Outside the office, Ethan believed he had built the perfect life. His wife, Claire, had entered his world long before Carter Construction became a billion-dollar company. They met during graduate school, where she admired his work ethic more than his family name. Ethan often joked that she kept him grounded while the business threatened to consume every hour of his life. Friends described them as the ideal couple. Charity events featured them smiling together on red carpets. Neighborhood gatherings always included their laughter, and social media showed vacations, anniversaries, and holiday celebrations that looked almost too perfect to be real. Ethan trusted Claire completely. In his mind, she represented the one place untouched by the ruthless competition of corporate America. He never imagined that the greatest betrayal of his life wasn't waiting inside the boardroom. It was already sharing his home. Over the previous year, Ryan had become a frequent visitor to Ethan's house. Family dinners turned into weekend barbecues, football games, birthday parties, and holiday celebrations. Claire always encouraged Ethan to invite his younger brother, insisting that family should remain close despite the pressures of running a major corporation. Ethan appreciated her kindness. Ryan appreciated something entirely different. Every visit allowed secret conversations to become longer, stolen glances to become bolder, and carefully hidden feelings to evolve into a dangerous relationship that neither of them intended to stop. Their affair didn't begin with passion. It began with shared frustration. Claire felt neglected by Ethan's endless work schedule, while Ryan convinced himself that everything Ethan owned should have belonged to him. Together, they discovered a common enemy without realizing how quickly their resentment would evolve into conspiracy. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Ethan left the office early after realizing he had forgotten confidential documents at home before an important meeting. It was a simple mistake, one he almost corrected by asking his assistant to retrieve the files instead. At the last second, he decided to drive home himself. Traffic was unusually light because of the storm, allowing him to arrive nearly an hour earlier than expected. As he stepped through the front door, he noticed something unusual. The television wasn't on. The house was silent except for distant laughter drifting from upstairs. At first, he smiled, assuming Claire was talking to a friend. Then he recognized the voice. Ryan. Ethan paused in the hallway, confused because his brother had never mentioned stopping by. He quietly climbed the staircase, intending to surprise them with a joke about plotting against him without inviting him. Instead, he reached the partially open bedroom door and saw something that instantly shattered every belief he held about the people he loved. Ryan wrapped his arms around Claire as she kissed him without hesitation, laughing as though Ethan no longer existed. Time seemed to slow until every heartbeat felt painfully loud inside Ethan's chest. His first instinct wasn't anger, it was disbelief. His mind desperately searched for another explanation, another possibility that made more sense than what his own eyes had witnessed. There wasn't one. He stood frozen, listening as Ryan leaned close enough for Ethan to hear every word. Just a little longer, Ryan whispered confidently. Once the board removes him, everything will belong to us. Claire smiled before answering with a sentence Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. I've already waited long enough. Ethan slowly stepped backward, careful not to make a sound. He walked down the staircase, opened the front door, climbed into his car, and drove away without ever letting them know he had been there. He drove for hours through the rain with no destination in mind, replaying those two sentences over and over until they no longer felt real. Most people imagine betrayal arriving with screaming arguments and shattered glass. Real betrayal is much quieter. It steals your ability to think, leaving nothing behind except silence and questions that have no immediate answers. Ethan didn't return to the office that afternoon. Instead, he drove aimlessly through downtown Chicago while rain hammered against the windshield, blurring the skyline into a sea of gray lights. Every traffic signal, every passing car, and every familiar street seemed strangely distant, as though the world had continued moving while his own had come to a complete stop. The image of Ryan and Claire together replayed endlessly in his mind, but it wasn't the affair that haunted him most. It was Ryan's words. "Once the board removes him, everything will belong to us." Those weren't the words of a man having an affair. Those were the words of someone executing a plan. Ethan had spent years negotiating billion-dollar contracts, identifying risks before they became disasters, and reading people whose livelihoods depended on deception. Deep down, his instincts were telling him something terrifying. The affair wasn't the betrayal. It was only one piece of something much larger. As darkness settled over the city, Ethan parked outside Lake Michigan and remained in his car for nearly an hour, watching waves crash against the shoreline. He considered confronting Claire. He imagined storming into Ryan's office and exposing everything. He even thought about walking away from the company entirely and starting over somewhere no one knew his name. But every scenario ended the same way. Ryan would deny everything. Claire would lie without hesitation. Unless Ethan had proof, the board would see a jealous husband making emotional accusations against the company's beloved executive vice president. Ryan had spent years building his public image, and he knew exactly how to weaponize it. Ethan understood something most people never did during moments of crisis. Acting too quickly often meant losing before the real fight had even begun. The following morning, Ethan arrived at headquarters as though nothing had happened. Employees greeted him with their usual smiles, executives shook his hand before meetings, and Ryan walked into the executive conference room carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Morning, big brother," he said with effortless confidence. "Thought you could use an extra shot of espresso today." Ethan accepted the cup with a calm smile that surprised even himself. Years of negotiating high-pressure business deals had taught him one invaluable skill: never reveal what you know until the right moment. Ryan interpreted Ethan's composure as ignorance. He had no idea his brother had crossed an invisible line the previous afternoon. From that moment forward, Ethan stopped seeing Ryan as family. He began seeing him as an opponent. That evening, Ethan contacted someone he hadn't spoken to in nearly 6 years. Daniel Mercer answered on the second ring. Before retiring, Daniel had spent more than 2 decades investigating organized financial crime for the FBI. His reputation for uncovering complex fraud schemes was legendary among federal prosecutors, and after leaving government service, he established one of the most respected private investigative firms in Illinois. Ethan had met him years earlier during a corporate security consultation and remembered 2 things about him. First, Daniel never made promises he couldn't keep. Second, he never accepted a case unless he believed the truth could be proven. When Ethan briefly explained that he suspected fraud, conspiracy, and a personal betrayal involving someone inside Carter Construction, Daniel remained silent for several seconds before giving a simple answer: "Meet me tomorrow morning. Don't tell anyone." Daniel listened without interrupting as Ethan described everything he had witnessed. Unlike most people, he didn't react emotionally. He asked questions: exact dates, financial decisions, board appointments, insurance policies, company restructures, access to confidential accounts. By the time Ethan finished speaking, Daniel had filled several pages with notes. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "You're focusing on the affair because it's personal," he said calmly. "I'm focusing on the business because that's where people usually make mistakes. If your brother is planning something bigger, there will be money moving somewhere it shouldn't." Ethan frowned. "How long will it take?" Daniel looked directly into his eyes. "That depends on how patient you're willing to be." Ethan didn't hesitate. "As long as it takes." The investigation began quietly. Daniel never approached Carter Construction directly. Instead, he started with public records, corporate filings, shell companies, vendor registrations, and banking patterns. Within 2 weeks, unusual transactions began appearing. Several consulting firms that had received millions of dollars from Carter Construction existed only on paper. Their listed office addresses belonged to empty buildings or virtual mailboxes. One company claimed to employ 50 consultants despite having no website, no staff directory, and no public business history. Another had received payments for project management services on construction sites that had never broken ground. Individually, the payments appeared legitimate. Together, they formed a financial trail worth nearly $18 million. Daniel followed every transfer until the money disappeared into a maze of offshore accounts registered through anonymous holding companies. Whoever designed the scheme understood corporate finance exceptionally well. Meanwhile, Ryan's confidence continued growing. He began speaking more aggressively during board meetings, openly questioning Ethan's leadership while presenting himself as the executive willing to make difficult decisions. Several board members who had once supported Ethan suddenly echoed Ryan's concerns. They criticized declining profit margins despite record revenues, questioned delayed expansion projects, and suggested that fresh leadership might better position the company for future growth. Ethan recognized the pattern immediately. Someone had been influencing them behind closed doors. The campaign wasn't random. It was coordinated. Every meeting chipped away at the trust he had spent years building. Ryan never attacked him directly. He simply planted doubts and allowed others to finish the job. It was manipulation disguised as corporate governance. 3 weeks later, Daniel requested an urgent meeting. He placed a thick folder on the table without saying a word. Inside were photographs, financial records, phone logs, and surveillance reports. Ryan wasn't merely having an affair with Claire. They had been meeting regularly with the chief financial officer of Carter Construction and 2 outside attorneys specializing in corporate succession planning. More disturbing was a document buried near the back of the folder, a recently updated life insurance policy naming Claire as the primary beneficiary. The coverage amount had increased dramatically just 4 months earlier. $50 million. Ethan remembered signing the paperwork after Claire insisted that higher coverage was standard practice for CEOs managing billion-dollar companies. At the time, the explanation had seemed perfectly reasonable. Now it felt like reading the opening chapter of his own obituary. Huh? Daniel remained unusually quiet before finally speaking. I don't think they're trying to ruin your career anymore. Ethan slowly looked up from the file. What do you mean? Daniel slid another photograph across the table. It showed Ryan meeting with a man known to federal investigators for arranging accidents involving wealthy clients. Officially, the man operated a risk management consulting company. Unofficially, his name had surfaced in multiple investigations involving staged vehicle collisions, industrial disasters, and unexplained deaths that generated massive insurance payouts. Although prosecutors had never secured enough evidence to convict him, his reputation within law enforcement was unmistakable. Daniel's expression hardened. If I'm right, he said quietly, your brother has stopped planning a corporate takeover. He's planning something permanent. Ethan closed the folder and stared through the office window at the Chicago skyline, now glowing beneath the evening lights. Fear should have overwhelmed him. Instead, he felt something colder and far more dangerous: clarity. Every lie, every strange business decision, every forced smile at family dinners, and every suspicious conversation suddenly fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across several years. Ryan hadn't become his enemy overnight. He had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. The only difference was that Ethan finally knew the game they were playing. And unlike Ryan, he wasn't interested in simply surviving it. He intended to win. Ethan knew there was only one way to survive. If Ryan truly believed he was smarter than everyone around him, then the safest place for Ethan was inside that illusion. From that moment forward, every smile Ethan offered, every signature he placed on a document, and every conversation he had with his brother became part of a performance. Each morning, he walked into Carter Construction headquarters, looking exactly like the dependable CEO everyone expected to see. He approved budgets, attended meetings, congratulated project managers on completed developments, and even laughed at Ryan's jokes whenever the opportunity presented itself. To everyone else, nothing had changed. But beneath that calm exterior, Ethan had become someone entirely different. He was no longer trying to protect his company. He was quietly building the case that would destroy every person who had betrayed him. Daniel Mercer expanded the investigation beyond financial records. His team began monitoring Ryan's movements, photographing meetings, tracing burner phones, and documenting every unusual interaction. Weeks passed without anything dramatic happening, yet every day added another piece to the puzzle. Ryan met repeatedly with the same mysterious consultant linked to several suspicious deaths, always choosing isolated restaurants or private country clubs far from downtown Chicago. Claire's schedule had also changed. She claimed to be attending charity committee meetings several evenings each week, but surveillance showed her meeting Ryan in luxury apartments rented under false names. They weren't simply continuing their affair. They were holding planning sessions. Daniel eventually noticed that nearly every meeting occurred shortly after board discussions involving Ethan's travel schedule or company events. It was becoming increasingly obvious that whatever Ryan intended to do would happen during one of Ethan's business trips. Meanwhile, pressure inside Carter Construction continued to mount. Anonymous leaks reached several business journalists questioning Ethan's leadership. One newspaper published an article suggesting that shareholders had quietly lost confidence in the company's direction. Financial blogs began speculating that Ryan Carter represented the future of the organization and that younger leadership could unlock enormous growth. None of the articles contained outright lies. Instead, they relied on carefully selected facts presented in ways that encouraged readers to draw damaging conclusions. Ethan immediately recognized Ryan's strategy. Reputation was far easier to destroy than rebuild, and once enough doubt existed, even loyal supporters began questioning their own judgment. Ryan wasn't trying to force Ethan out overnight. He was patiently creating an environment where removing Ethan would appear to be the logical decision. One afternoon, after a particularly tense board meeting, Ryan casually walked into Ethan's office, carrying 2 glasses of expensive bourbon. "Long day," he said with an easy smile as he placed one glass on the desk. "Dad always said we solved our biggest problems over a drink." Ethan accepted the glass without hesitation. Ryan leaned comfortably against the window overlooking the Chicago skyline and spoke as though they were simply 2 brothers discussing business. "You've been working yourself too hard lately," Ryan said. "The board notices it. Investors notice it. Maybe you should take a vacation after we finish the Aspen retreat next month." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Aspen?" Ryan nodded enthusiastically. "Executive leadership retreat. Investors, board members, major clients. It'll be good for everyone. Fresh mountain air, relaxed environment. We can reconnect as a family." Ethan smiled politely while silently remembering Daniel's warning. Ryan wasn't inviting him on a retreat. He was choosing the location. That evening, Daniel confirmed Ethan's suspicion. Through intercepted communications and surveillance, his team discovered that Ryan had arranged a private helicopter flight from Aspen to a remote construction site located deep within the Colorado mountains. Officially, the purpose of the trip was to inspect land purchased for a future luxury resort development. Unofficially, Daniel uncovered something deeply disturbing. Ryan's mysterious associate had already visited the site twice during the previous month, accompanied by a helicopter maintenance contractor with a history of regulatory violations. Although there wasn't enough evidence to prove sabotage, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Daniel spread aerial photographs across his office table. Steep cliffs surrounded the proposed landing area, with miles of dense forest below. Emergency response times would exceed several hours. If something happened there, rescue would be nearly impossible. Daniel looked directly at Ethan. "You don't have to go." Ethan studied the photographs for several moments before answering. "If I cancel, Ryan changes the plan." Daniel slowly nodded. "Probably," Ethan continued. "Then we lose our best chance to expose him." Daniel frowned. "Or you lose your life." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression calmer than Daniel had ever seen. He spent years believing, "I'm predictable. If I suddenly become cautious, he'll know something has changed. I need him completely confident." Daniel remained silent before finally asking the question that had been bothering him since the investigation began. "What exactly are you planning?" Ethan's eyes settled on the photograph of the mountain valley. I'm going to let him believe he succeeded. For the first time since taking the case, Daniel was genuinely speechless. Ethan calmly explained his idea. If Ryan believed Ethan had died during the trip, he would immediately begin consolidating power, moving stolen money, destroying evidence, and exposing every co-conspirator involved in the plot. The people hiding behind lawyers, shell companies, and carefully crafted public images would suddenly feel safe enough to make mistakes. Instead of arresting one guilty person, they could expose an entire criminal network. Daniel understood the strategy, but it carried enormous risk. If anything went wrong, Ethan wouldn't have a second opportunity. You realize? Daniel said quietly, that everyone you know, including your mother, will think you're dead. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. If that's the price of uncovering the truth, then that's the price I'll pay. The following weeks became a carefully choreographed performance. Daniel secretly contacted a small group of trusted federal investigators, explaining only the parts of the operation necessary for legal authorization. Every communication was encrypted. Every meeting took place in secure locations. Ethan quietly updated his personal affairs, placing several confidential letters into Daniel's custody, with instructions not to deliver them unless absolutely necessary. He transferred ownership of certain personal assets into protected trusts and ensured that critical company records could not be altered without triggering automatic alerts. To anyone watching from the outside, Ethan appeared to be preparing for another routine business trip. In reality, he was preparing to disappear from the world. Ryan, meanwhile, had never seemed happier. He became increasingly affectionate toward Ethan, insisting they spend more time together before the Aspen conference. Claire also behaved differently, showing unusual concern for Ethan's health, encouraging him to relax more often and repeatedly reminding him how dangerous constant stress could become. Ethan noticed every detail, every forced smile, every rehearsed conversation, every overly kind gesture. They weren't trying to repair their relationship. They were making sure there would be no lingering suspicion after he was gone. Watching the performance became almost surreal. The people closest to him weren't merely lying. They were auditioning for the roles they intended to play after his death. Finally, the morning of the Aspen retreat arrived. A private jet waited on the runway while executives, investors, and board members greeted one another with cheerful conversations about skiing, luxury hotels, and future business opportunities. Ryan stood near the aircraft entrance, shaking hands and laughing naturally with everyone he met. When Ethan approached, Ryan placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is going to be a great trip," he said warmly. Ethan returned the smile without the slightest hesitation. "I have a feeling it'll be one none of us will ever forget." Ryan laughed, believing the comment referred to the resort project waiting in Colorado. Ethan meant something entirely different. As the aircraft doors closed and the engines began to roar, Daniel watched from inside an unmarked vehicle parked beyond the private terminal. He knew that once the jet disappeared into the clouds, events already set in motion would become impossible to stop. Somewhere inside that cabin sat a man planning his brother's murder. Sitting only a few feet away was the brother who already knew everything. Neither man realized that before the week ended, the entire country would believe only one of them had survived. The Carter Construction private jet landed in Aspen just before noon, greeted by crisp mountain air, towering pine forests, and a sky so clear it almost looked artificial. To everyone attending the executive retreat, it was another opportunity to strengthen business relationships while enjoying one of Colorado's most exclusive luxury resorts. Investors laughed over expensive whiskey. Board members discussed upcoming projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And photographers captured images of the company's leadership standing together against the breathtaking backdrop of snow-covered peaks. Ethan smiled in every photograph. Ryan smiled even wider. Looking at those pictures later, investigators would remark on one chilling detail. One brother knew he was about to be murdered. The other believed he was about to become a billionaire. The first 2 days unfolded exactly as Ryan had planned. Business presentations filled the mornings, while lavish dinners occupied the evenings. Ethan noticed Ryan watching him constantly, not with affection, but with quiet calculation. Every conversation seemed rehearsed, every compliment slightly exaggerated, every invitation carefully timed. Claire called several times each day, asking if he was enjoying himself and reminding him not to work too hard. Ethan answered warmly every time, pretending nothing had changed. Behind the scenes, however, Daniel Mercer remained in constant communication through an encrypted satellite device hidden inside Ethan's luggage. Federal agents had quietly positioned themselves throughout Colorado, waiting for the operation to reach its final stage. They couldn't intervene too early. They needed Ryan to commit himself completely. On the third morning, Ryan approached Ethan during breakfast, carrying a rolled-up set of construction plans. "The helicopter leaves in 45 minutes, he said casually. "The investors decided to stay behind, but I'd still like your opinion on the Canyon property before we finalize the purchase." Ethan glanced at the blueprints before nodding. "Sounds good," Ryan smiled. "Just the two of us. Like old times." Ethan returned the smile, though internally he couldn't remember the last time anything between them had resembled old times. As they walked toward the private helipad outside the resort, Ethan noticed Daniel's final text message appear briefly on his secure device. "Everything is in position. Trust the plan." Ethan quietly deleted the message before climbing aboard the helicopter. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the cold mountain air, climbing above endless forests blanketed in snow. From that height, the world appeared peaceful, untouched by greed, betrayal, or violence. Ryan sat opposite Ethan, pointing toward valleys and ridges while describing future hotel developments that would supposedly transform the region into a luxury destination. Ethan listened politely, occasionally asking questions that encouraged Ryan to keep talking. The more confident Ryan became, the more careless he grew. Nearly 30 minutes into the flight, Ryan leaned toward the pilot and casually asked how much farther remained. "About 8 minutes, the pilot answered. Ryan smiled and settled back into his seat. Ethan noticed him glance discreetly at his watch before sending a brief text message from his phone. Daniel had predicted exactly that. Every movement matched the surveillance reports collected over the previous month. Sure. Moments later, the helicopter lurched violently. A warning alarm illuminated the instrument panel as the aircraft suddenly lost altitude. The pilot's expression changed instantly. He grabbed the controls, fighting to stabilize the helicopter, as another warning light began flashing. The engine coughed once. Then again. "We've got a problem," the pilot shouted above the growing noise. Ryan widened his eyes in convincing surprise, gripping his seat as though terrified. Ethan remained calm. He had expected something to happen, although even he couldn't predict exactly how Ryan intended to execute the plan. The helicopter descended rapidly toward a narrow valley, surrounded by steep cliffs. Snow swirled outside the windows as the pilot desperately searched for a place to land. Then everything happened at once. A deafening impact shook the aircraft as it struck the mountainside, tearing through trees before sliding across the snow-covered ground. Metal twisted violently. Glass shattered. The helicopter spun nearly 180 degrees before finally crashing into a cluster of boulders. Silence followed almost immediately, interrupted only by the crackling sound of damaged electrical systems and the distant howl of mountain winds. Ethan slowly opened his eyes. His seatbelt had held. Blood trickled down the side of his forehead from a superficial cut, but he remained conscious. The pilot wasn't moving. Ryan appeared unconscious, several feet away, though Ethan noticed something unusual. His injuries looked surprisingly minor considering the severity of the crash, almost as though he had known exactly how to brace for impact. Before Ethan could fully gather his thoughts, movement appeared outside the shattered cabin. Two men, wearing heavy winter clothing, approached through the blowing snow. They weren't rescue workers. There were no emergency markings on their jackets, no medical equipment, no radios broadcasting distress calls. One of them opened the damaged side door, while the other immediately looked toward Ryan. To Ethan's surprise, Ryan slowly sat up, wiped a small amount of blood from his forehead, and calmly climbed out of the wreckage without a trace of panic. Their eyes met briefly. Ryan's expression no longer contained even the slightest hint of brotherly affection. It contained satisfaction. Pure, unmistakable satisfaction. "Make sure he's dead," Ryan said coldly, before turning his back and walking away into the snow. The two men stepped toward Ethan, believing he had suffered far more serious injuries than he actually had. One reached inside his jacket, revealing a suppressed handgun. Before either man could react, another voice echoed across the valley. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." Within seconds, armed officers emerged from multiple directions, hidden positions, revealing themselves behind rocks and trees. The two hired men froze, stunned that anyone else had reached the crash site so quickly. One attempted to raise his weapon, but was tackled immediately by an agent. The second surrendered without resistance. Ryan spun around in disbelief, just as Daniel Mercer appeared from behind a snow-covered ridge, wearing tactical gear. Ryan's confident smile disappeared for the first time in years. He looked toward the helicopter and watched Ethan slowly climb out alive. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Ryan simply stared, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Ethan walked forward despite the blood running down his face, stopping only a few feet away from his younger brother. "Looking for someone?" Ethan asked quietly. Ryan's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Every plan, every lie, every secret meeting, and every carefully orchestrated betrayal collapsed in that single moment. He had spent years preparing for his brother's death. He had never once considered the possibility that his brother had been preparing for his downfall instead.
Support us by liking and subscribing. Share your theories in the comments. Until next time, stay vigilant.